Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Moore. I'm the CEO of the Virginia Funders Network. We are so glad to have so many of you join us this afternoon for our third annual pre-General Assembly briefing. We have a great session lined up for you today with two experts who are going to give us a preview of what's coming up at the General Assembly this year. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Robin Mockenhaupt, who's going to moderate today's session, did want to highlight that this is the first time that we're going to be using a new programming format. So throughout this year, this is our first attempt at this. We're going to have large issue briefings like today's pre-General Assembly briefing, and then we're going to break out into smaller work groups, what we're calling communities of practice. So funders, health funders, education funders, social justice funders, community foundations, etc., will have an opportunity to debrief what we just learned during the briefing, compare notes with each other, and talk about what, if anything, we might want to do together or in our own work based on what we have learned. So we hope that this new format will be a great opportunity for us to build community, to collaborate with each other, and have an opportunity to learn about each other's work and hopefully apply that in our own day-to-day practices as well. So we hope that you enjoyed today's briefing, that you find it valuable, and that you are able to connect with your colleagues in a meaningful way. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Robin Mockenhaupt, the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at VFN.
Great, Katie, thanks so much, and welcome to everyone. We're really pleased to have you here. This, as Katie said, is our third annual pre-General Assembly update. We hope this will be an annual event. And as you know, the General Assembly begins tomorrow at noon and runs for 30 days unless it's extended. So today, what we're going to be talking about with the help of two terrific speakers, whom I'll introduce in just a minute, is what to expect in the General Assembly session for 2023. We're going to provide at the beginning an overview of kind of where we are in the state and state government right now, a little bit of the history since the fall elections and what's happened since then, including, as some of you may know, 3 special elections today, Tuesday, and the outcome of those will impact the session starting tomorrow, the impacts of redistricting. And so there's a lot of dynamics going on in the environment right now that will impact the session and the rest of the year. So we'll be talking about that today. We also hope to dig into some key issues, which I think funders across the Commonwealth will be interested in, related to health, education, housing, economic security, social justice. So I think there will be something for everyone in today's conversation. And as Katie mentioned, we're trying this pilot. So after our 2 speakers speak, we'll be breaking into small breakout groups and give everyone a chance to dig in a little bit more to issues of importance to them and what to anticipate for the year. So as I mentioned, we are really fortunate in Virginia to have these 2 leaders who are on the panel with us today. The first one is David Poole, who's the executive director at the Virginia Public Access Project. And you'll see in a minute in the chat, bios are going to be dropped into there and you can read more about each of our speakers. But David is the founder of the Public Access Project, or VPAP. And going on, I think, 26 years now. So, David, we're delighted to have you with us. He formerly was a newspaper reporter and covered the state capitol for one of the papers he worked for. So we're delighted to have you to provide that background context setting for us. And then our second speaker is Ashley Kenneth, who is the president and CEO at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Ashley is currently the CEO, but formerly was the Senior Vice President for Policy and Legislative Affairs, and before that worked for the Multiple Sclerosis Society. So she has worked in policy and advocacy for decades now. And as I said, we're just really lucky in the Commonwealth to have both of these leaders and their organizations to help us understand a little bit more what our own civic duty is, how to be active as foundations and funders in the state, and to be engaged. So the format for today is I'm going to invite each of the speakers. They'll have about 25 minutes, including questions and answers. So please take the time to be thinking about your questions as you're listening to the presentations. Drop your questions in the chat. There will be plenty of time for each of them to address questions that come up. And then about the last half hour or so, we'll be going into the breakout rooms, but I'll come back and tell you a little bit more at that time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to David Poole to set the context for us. So welcome to all.
Thank you, Robin. And I'm going to share my screen here in a second. As Robin said, I'm going to be talking really about what we specialize in, and that is elections and redistricting. And then Ashley will do the policy after I go. So I'm going to share my screen here. And it's rolling. So there are, on the eve of the election, there's two elections, special elections that are filling vacancies in the General Assembly. There's two in the House of Delegates, one Republican seat in the Shenandoah Valley, one Democratic seat in Northern Virginia. Both are overwhelmingly one-sided districts, so the results are expected to be as static in the House, and that is Republicans will have a majority of 52 seats, Democrats have 48. The Senate is a different story. The Senate is a very narrow, in the last session, the Democrats had a 21-19 lead. There's one district in the Senate that is open. That's because in Virginia Beach, Jen Kiggins, state senator, first-term state senator, was elected to Congress. That has opened up a vacancy in a district. A lot of times what you see are these special elections held right before the session on the eve of the General Assembly are, there's no question. However, this is truly a toss-up district. And let me go forward here. The district is mostly in Virginia Beach, kind of the western part of Virginia Beach, and 3 precincts in Norfolk. But what's special about this district is it is a true swing district. These are the results. Some of them are estimated, so none of these are exactly precise, except the 2019. But you can see this district has gone Republican, barely, in most cases, a very close election, 3 out of the last 5 elections. So this district has gone back and forth, most notably Elaine Loria, who lost, the incumbent Democrat who lost to Kiggins in the congressional race. She actually carried Kiggins' old district by a slight margin. So the 2 candidates are 2 Black gentlemen from Virginia Beach, and this one really could come down to a close call. Now, what's at stake here, of course, is the Democrats, if they pick up this seat, if they flip the seat, they'll have a 22-18 majority, which is a little bit more room for comfort. You have to remember, in the Senate, the tiebreaker who gets to vote in most types of votes is the lieutenant governor, who's a Republican. So on crucial questions about like abortion, where the Democrats have a couple of pro-life members who it's perhaps not certain how they might vote on a key question like abortion. This election could have a huge ramification in the upcoming session. Any number of other issues where if the Democrats, if the Republicans hold this seat, their ability to kind of peel off a couple of Democrats on certain issues becomes much higher. Whereas the Democrats, if they can win this seat, gives them a chance to exert a stronger majority, marginally stronger, but could be that one vote can make a big difference. So you have, and I'm sure Ashley will talk about this, you have a shared power situation where the Republicans have a slight majority in the House, the Democrats have a slim majority in the Senate. Of course, the governor's mansion is controlled by a Republican Governor Youngkin. But this is not the only election. You got to keep in mind the session, if everything goes as past short sessions, the last day of session would be scheduled to be the 25th of February. On the 21st there's a special election for in Congressional District 4. You recall Donald McEachin passed away shortly after the election. And one of the Democratic candidate is State Senator Jen McClellan. So you have a situation where if she wins, and I'm not sure when she would need to resign and go to Washington. I'm sure the Democrats in Washington will want her to get her as quickly as possible. But if she were to leave, that's, right away, that's a couple of days before the end of the session. And a lot of the key votes are delayed to the very end. Again, that would narrow the Democrats' majority. So I don't know if the speakers are blurb is covering this up on your screen, but there's two. So now there's 2 seats in question, right? One will not be filled. If McClellan leaves, it will not be filled. But the other seat, it depends on what happens. If the GOP wins the election today, once McClellan, who's expected to win this election, it's an overwhelming Democratic seat. We can presume McClellan will win. If the GOP wins today in Senate District 7, the Democrats will have a 20-19 majority after the departure, whenever that is. And if the Democrats win, they'll have a 21-18 margin. And that will be not only in the last few days potentially of the session, but remember, they come back like 6 weeks later for a veto session to consider vetoes and amendments. And amendments only have to pass by a simple majority. That would be a great opportunity for Governor Youngkin to get some measures through that might have passed with a certain Democratic majority would be lessened by 1 vote. So that could have implications in the veto session as well. So I know I've only got a certain amount of time, so I'm going to go a really quick, high level talk about redistricting. Ashley may talk about what it means in election years in the General Assembly. It often means not a lot gets done, particularly in when you have a divided power. But in this case, there's a lot of uncertainty about the elections, and that is in redistricting. Of course, I'm just going to do a high level thing. There's a rule that came out during the civil rights about 1 man, 1 vote, so that a district in South Side has to have roughly the same number of votes as voters as the district, say, in Northern Virginia. The idea is if you vote for someone in South Side, the weight of your vote in the General Assembly should have the same weight as somebody voting anywhere in the state. So, of course, what happens over time is the population changes, the birth rate, death rate, migration, and before you know it, after a decade, from 2010 to 2020, the population in like areas in Southwest Virginia lost population. So they're falling behind the rest of the state, while Loudoun County and the 10th Congressional District was growing. So you have the populations are not equal. The 1 man, 1 vote rule means you have to redraw the districts. That means areas that are losing population lose influences as seats are transferred to areas where the population is growing. But it also it also really in the past in redistricting, the lines were drawn by the legislators themselves, who were very conscious of where they lived and how close the nearest person was. And the lines were carefully drawn so no one was drawn into the same district. If that ever happened, if 2 people were drawn in the same district, it was usually mischief by the party in power that was trying to thin the ranks of the party out of power. You might, if the Democrats have control, they might put 2 Republicans in the same district. That means someone's got to retire. You're gonna reduce their ranks by 1. What happened in the redistricting, of course, is that the voters in 2021 or 2020 rather passed a constitutional amendment to set up a bipartisan redistricting commission that had half legislators and half citizens. Well, that commission just could not come to agreement. So the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, drew the lines, and they hired these consultants who didn't even know, they didn't bother to know where the legislators lived. And they drew these these incumbent blind districts, that these districts that are shown and shaded in light purple are areas where two delegates were put together, and the dark is 3 were put in the same place initially. And that affected 40 of the 100 House members, and 19 of the senators were paired together. Some of these pairings have worked out as people have moved, saying they're going to move to other districts, but there's some key seats, particular Senate District 26, Ryan McDougall and Tommy Norman, the Republican leader, are in the same district, as in Hampton Roads, Lionel Spruill and Louise Lucas. So this is going to create a whole different dynamic. It's also going to mean possibly we're looking at really elevated turnover in this election, as these pairings end up meaning certain incumbents perhaps lose a primary or just retire. So that will become clear. I just want to make, after we got a couple seconds before questions, I want to put in a plug for VA News. If you're not reading VA News and you want to know what's going on in Virginia politics, you need to start and go to our website and subscribe. It's a free email that goes out to more than 22,000 people every day. We go to every newspaper, every online outlet. We aggregate them into an easy to read, organized report. And you can spend as little time or as much time, but it keeps you informed. So go sign up to VA News, and at that, I'll answer some questions.
Great, David, thanks so much for that. Appreciate it. So please drop your questions for David and for Ashley when she speaks in the chat box. David, do you want to say anything about, I know tonight, given that we have elections happening today, I know that there is election results will be online tonight. So do you want to say another word about that?
Sure. If you're curious about what's happening, go to our website, vpap.org tonight. Starting at 7 o'clock, we'll have the results. Hopefully it shouldn't be too late of a night. There's not a whole lot, how many results, but this will tell you, you'll be the first to know how this, particularly the Senate District 7 seat, might affect the General Assembly.
Great, thanks. Your service is just so fabulous. And I have to tell you, every morning, one of the first things I do after I turn my computer on is go read that morning's VPAP news. So I highly recommend it if you're not on the list that David just mentioned to sign up, because you'll find out what's happening in the Commonwealth in a short period of time by just looking at the news of the day. And it's a terrific service. So thank you for that. So questions for David about sort of context setting. You know, I thought last year when we were having this conversation at the pre-General Assembly session that it was an incredibly unique year. And here we are in 2023, another incredibly unique year, just given what happened last fall and today, and the impact over the course of this session and in February. So another interesting year ahead. So questions, comments for David?
Great. Well, I'll leave more time for Ashley.
Okay, well, don't go anywhere, David. I'm sure people will be thinking about it. So stay online. But in the meantime, Ashley, welcome again. Did the introductions earlier, but we're really delighted to have you on board to help us think through, given that context, what are some of the key issues that funders should be paying attention to, and that certainly TCI will be paying attention to over the course of this session?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see this, see my slides?
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. It's an honor to be here and to share space with David. TCI loves VPAP. I read the news every morning, and I will be frantically pressing refresh on my browser this evening. So I think that many of you are already familiar with TCI and our work, but we are a nonprofit that does policy research, analysis, and advocacy, and we work in partnership and in solidarity with community in order to advance racial and economic justice in Virginia. TCI has played a critical role in advancing major policy reform in the Commonwealth throughout our 16-year history, including in recent years with Medicaid expansion and raising the minimum wage. But we are particularly known for our budget analysis and the resources that we produce to help lawmakers and to help advocates understand the state budget in a comprehensive and a really accessible way. So today I am going to give a very brief overview of some of the most recent census data regarding how Virginia families are doing. I'll talk about a few issues of importance to TCI this legislative session, including tax policy, health coverage, and K-12 education, as well as the decriminalization of poverty and expanding worker power. The key takeaway from the 2021 census data is that when government takes action to provide direct financial help to families, it makes significant and an undeniable difference. Because of the improved child tax credit and the earned income tax credit at the federal level, as well as the increase in food access and the adjusted cost of living during the pandemic, poverty decreased significantly across the country, and notably here in Virginia. The median household income remains steady at the pre-pandemic level of just under $81,000 after adjusting for inflation. We continue to see that great improvements in health insurance coverage as a result of Medicaid expansion in the state, as well as some of the improvements in access to healthcare at the federal level, such as increased subsidies for the healthcare marketplace and enhanced funding for Medicaid. Nonetheless, there are still many disparities, and those disparities are particularly high for the Indigenous population, Latinx communities, as well as non-citizens in Virginia. So those facts and figures provide important background for why the issues that I'm going to talk about today are important to be addressed during this upcoming session. As David mentioned, it's going to be a really tough year to move issues forward. It's an election year, we have a divided government, but it's not impossible. And I think it's important to continue pushing forward on progressive policies that break down barriers and create opportunity. Last year, even with the divided General Assembly, they voted to make our state's earned income tax credit partially refundable. And this was a huge win for advocates, as well as for low-income working families across the state. It means that thousands of families will now see more money back at tax time to help them make ends meet and to care for their families. We know that, especially from the positive impact of the federal credits, that targeted tax reforms benefit working families in Virginia. And the word targeted is very key there, because many of the tax proposals from the governor's administration would not impact low-income working families in the same way. In fact, some of them leave these families out entirely. So in 2023, we're going to try for 20% or full refundability, which will mean an even larger benefit for families. And in the future, we plan to ensure that the credit is open to all low-income working families, including those who file their taxes with an individual tax identification number as opposed to a Social Security number. One other tax policy priority for us is creating a state-level child tax credit. We know that the federal CTC, again, lifts children and families out of poverty, and the improvements made by the federal government to the CTC have now expired. And so many families are already have or will be sliding back deeper into poverty. So we can do something at the state level to help protect some of the gains for families, and that's to join 12 other states and enact our own state-level child tax credit that will target families who earn below $100,000 a year. The EITC legislation is being carried by Delegate Price. Senator McClellan and Delegate Tran are carrying the CTC legislation, which would create a $500 refundable credit for children under the age of 18, again, for households earning under $100,000 a year. In December, Governor Youngkin announced his proposed amendments to the 23-24 biennium budget, and his response to the record revenue that Virginia has been experiencing is to cut the corporate tax rate from 6% to 5%, with the intention of eventually reaching 4%, lower the individual income tax rate from 5.75% to 5.5%, and further increase the standard deduction, among a few other proposals. I think it's important for us to remember that we're in a time where corporate profits are at a near all-time high, Inflation is forcing everyday families to live paycheck to paycheck. And specifically, the governor's tax proposals will cost about $1 billion. And a majority of those benefits are reserved for profitable corporations. So rather than ensuring corporations pay their fair share, the governor's plan would actually tax a family's income at a higher rate than corporate profits. And TCI believes that any tax changes should focus on helping families who have been struggling with rising costs. And so making the EITC fully refundable and establishing a state child tax credit are smart, targeted investments in Virginia's families and in Virginia's future. So switching gears to healthcare, one of the reasons that we saw lower uninsured rates in Virginia in the census data is that during the pandemic, in order for the state to receive more money for Medicaid, Virginia had to agree to provide continuous coverage or not kick anyone off of the Medicaid rolls until the end of the public health emergency. Thankfully, the public health emergency has continued to be extended by President Biden and was recently extended for what we're expecting to be the last time. And so the provision requiring people to not lose their health coverage will come to an end. And we're anticipating that happening in April 2023. And that's when the state will have to do what they're calling redetermination and essentially re-enroll every Medicaid recipient and determine their eligibility. Now, we know that a lot of change has happened throughout the pandemic, right? Like people have moved, lost their housing. So it's expected that people of color and children are especially going to be disproportionately impacted by this change because they may not be able to be reached or families may simply not understand what's happening in order to re-enroll them. There are a lot of great folks working on this issue, but there is still a significant concern that people will get lost in the process. And so we need targeted programs, but also good data to ensure that we aren't missing the most vulnerable folks. So we're expecting that a budget amendment may be introduced to make sure that we're collecting the right data to make sure we're keeping track of who might be falling through the cracks. Another healthcare priority that we have is a bill to cover all kids. This legislation will create a state-funded health coverage option for children, regardless of immigration status. And we estimate that by making this policy change, 1 in 10 uninsured Virginia children will receive health coverage. Virginia would not be alone in creating this health coverage option for children, regardless of immigration status. A total of 10 other states, as well as the District of Columbia, currently use or plan to use state funds to cover income-eligible children in their Medicaid programs who would otherwise be ineligible due to immigration status. Senator McClellan is also a champion for this issue, and Delegate Tran is carrying this legislation in the House. One additional policy that TCI is supporting in conjunction with the Healthcare for All Virginians Coalition is legislation to remove the surcharge that health insurance companies are able to apply to tobacco users. Evidence has shown that surcharges do not in fact reduce tobacco use and can instead create a cost barrier to accessing treatment and cessation programs. Research has also shown that people who are low income, Black individuals, and people living in rural areas are more likely to smoke and therefore more likely to be impacted by that surcharge. K-12 education will likely be one of the most important issues of the session, along with tax policy, because it is a priority area for Governor Youngkin. And I have quite a few slides on education because, thanks to my amazing staff, we have some great visuals to share, but I also think it's really important that we just counter some of the negative narrative out there about failing schools and failing teachers, because that argument is inappropriately misdirecting the blame. We know that from decades of research that money matters for student outcomes, and we also know that Virginia is not doing all that it can to invest in great schools. Virginia is the 10th highest state in terms of median household income, yet is 41st in state spending on K-12 education. And as long as I've been doing this work, those numbers have hardly changed. And that low effort is in terms of state funding. We know that Virginia's students, parents, and teachers are making the effort to succeed despite the tremendous challenges of the pandemic. And many Virginia communities have invested in great schools, in large part because some of those local governments can make up the difference for inadequate state support. But in many places across Virginia that have fewer resources, students go to crumbling schools and don't receive enough help. So what does this mean concretely? Inadequate funding means less help for Virginia students, particularly in communities with the highest needs, who can't afford to make up for the state not fully funding the schools. For example, the arbitrary cap on state funding for support staff means that even as enrollment grew by 16,000 students from 2009 to 2021, the number of support staff such as technology specialists, janitors, administrative staff in Virginia schools shrunk by about 3,600. And as you can see in the figure on the right, it would have shrunk even more if local governments hadn't picked up some of the slack and funded more support staff without help from the state. It also means that we're driving away too many overstretched teachers, failing to recruit young people into the field. Virginia has the third worst teacher pay penalty in the country, with teachers being paid just 67 cents for every dollar paid to their peers and other professions with similar credentials and experience. It also means that some of the students with the highest needs are falling further behind. And you can see in the blue line on the graph on the left that Virginia has made considerable progress in graduation rates for students who are not English learners. However, for EL students, the 4-year graduation rate is still just 73%, up only slightly from 69% in 2008. And looking at the 6-year graduation rate versus the 4-year rate doesn't make much of a difference at all. But we know, of course, that it doesn't have to be this way. Looking at the graph on the right, you see that the new National Assessment for Educational Progress, or NAEP results, show that Virginia is doing less well than many other states for English learners. Virginia's average 4th grade reading score for English learners is 32nd out of 46 states plus DC for whom we have data, and is well below the national average. For other students, we're more in the middle, tied with 7 other states for 18th out of 50 states plus DC. Unfortunately, unlike in some other funding areas, last year's budget did not include any additional funding to meet the Board of Education's prescribed number of instructors for English learners. But we know that Virginia can and must do better. So TCI does our education work in partnership with several other organizations, including the Fund Our Schools Coalition. And together we've laid out priorities for the coming year that will reinvest in our schools and help reach that vision of great schools in every community. We are asking for lawmakers to fully fund the standards of quality, fund wraparound services like before and after school, free lunch, make meaningful investments in student supports, increase teacher and staff pay, and prevent the diversion of funding from K-12 schools via privatization efforts, vouchers, lab schools, or any other large tax cuts that would prevent us from fully funding our schools. This slide highlights the actual legislation that we are anticipating, as well as the patrons. You see Delegate Bourne and Senator McClellan and Senator Hashmi are working on fully funding our schools by fully funding the standards of quality. We have legislation around English learners introduced by Senator Hashmi, as well as raising teacher and staff pay, and then of course defeating any diversions of K-12 funding. On this slide, you can see what these changes will mean for our schools. It would mean that the state is stepping up and funding its share of counselors, health providers, assistant principals, specialized instructors for English learners, and 6,500 additional support staff, all of whom will be more fairly paid. In contrast, the corporate income tax cut that I mentioned that the governor is proposing will cost $362 million in this budget and more in future years. And Virginia simply can't afford that when we still aren't fully funding our schools. With that $362 million, the state government could instead be paying its share of salaries for thousands of additional school counselors and nurses and critical staff to help our children learn. We are watching and working on a number of criminal justice related bills as well, particularly in the area of fines and fees. When a person is convicted, even for a very minor offense in criminal court, they are often saddled with fines, but also fees, which help to pay for the operation of the court system. These fines and fees can lead to significant debt, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and keeping people tied to the system. Our research has shown that there's a strong, statistically significant relationship between the amount of fines and fees assessed per capita and the share of the population that is Black in particular areas of the state. It's a system that sets people up to fail without offering many alternatives. In 2019, district and circuit courts in Virginia assessed at least $105 million in fines and fees related to traffic and criminal cases against Black Virginians, which was 33% of all of the traffic and criminal fines and fees, while Black Virginians made up just 19% of the population. In 2020, we saw assessed fines and fees related to traffic and criminal court cases against Black Virginians reduced to 71 million. So that's a 32% decrease. However, with the overall decrease in assessments in 2020, Black Virginians remained assessed for 33% of the share. And so this data illustrates that Black individuals are consistently overrepresented in the fines and fees system, even when relief policies are enacted. They are not, they're disproportionate beneficiaries of those relief policies. And if policy is advanced to reduce the impact of fines and fees for traffic and criminal related offenses, it will be really important to consider the historical impact and the racism that has taken place against the Black community and work to correct for that. So we know that this is not an issue that can be eradicated overnight, but we have been taking significant steps over the last several years to directly listen to and engage with people who are impacted by fines and fees and work together to enact impactful change. This year, we are working on 2 pieces of legislation. One, to lower the statute of limitations on the collection of court fines and fees, which can be as long as 60 years, as well as a bill that would require better data collection and dissemination of the impact of fines and fees by race. And the last issue I'll touch on very briefly is expanding worker power. This is an area where we have worked primarily at the local level since the 2021 repeal at the state level on the prohibition of local level public sector bargaining. And so many local advocates are successfully pushing for collective bargaining ordinances in their localities. And TCI has been supporting these efforts with historical and economic research. In addition to ensuring that the state does more when it comes to teacher pay and fully funding our schools, it's also important that teachers have a stronger voice on the job, and doing so will lead to stronger student outcomes, greater retention, and stronger schools overall. And this slide indicates the progress that has been made in localities across the state and public sector collective bargaining, as well as public school systems. And then at the state level, we'll certainly be watching throughout the legislative session to see if any defensive work might be necessary around collective bargaining, around labor and wage issues. It'll be particularly important to protect the state's minimum wage, which is now at $12 an hour, as well as lay the foundation for future increases so that we can eventually reach a floor of $15. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, but I also encourage you to stay in touch with us on social media and on our website. Later this week, quite literally, it might be tomorrow or the day after that, we are going to be releasing our analysis on how the governor's amendments compare to the current state budget. And so hopefully you'll be able to find that on our website, and it'll be helpful for you, and you'll find it to be easily accessible. Thank you.
Great. Ashley, thank you so much for that. That was a fabulous dive into covering the waterfront of issues that may come up in the General Assembly.